doesn't really matter what the size or scope of the goal is. What matters is that it matters to you.
Is there any kind of pattern to boredom?
There is a pattern over the lifespan. Boredom sort of tends to start rising in those early teenage years. It starts to sort of peak at age 17 or 18 and then starts to dip. And that's a really important point in our development, because around those late teenage years and the early 20s, that's the final stage of brain maturation. So you start to do what's called myelination, which is essentially this fatty coating that goes around your neurons and aids transmission of information. And so that myelination of your frontal cortex, that's happening between 17 and 22. Like, you're not really fully developed until those early 20s years. So around that time, when you're developing the frontal part of your brain, that's really critical for self-regulation, self-control, goal pursuit, decision-making, and so on. Around that time, your boredom starts to drop, and it drops off into the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. And in part, some of that's going to be about responsibilities. Who among us has the time to be bored when you're, pursuing your career, when you're raising your children, when you're doing all these other sorts of things? And then it does show there are some instances now where we see a rise into the 60s and beyond. And one of the notions there about that rise at the later stage of our lifespan is that it's sort of strongly associated with loneliness. And so we talk about a social connectedness in that age range. And if the people that have a good social network and good social connectedness tend not to be bored in their 60s, 70s and beyond.
Are certain people more than predisposed to becoming bored? Do people does it vary from person to person, like how quickly they get bored?
Yeah, so we talk about trait boredom proneness. And so some people are high in boredom proneness and some people are low in it. So there is a wide range of how often people feel it. And there are a range of sort of individual differences that we would talk about that make someone a little bit more prone to boredom. One of the common ones that we've researched a lot is the capacity for self-control. And I want to be clear here about what we're sort of talking about. This is not what a lot of people think about in terms of sort of impulse control. So some of your listeners might be familiar with this marshmallow test. You put a marshmallow in front of a kid and you say, you can have that marshmallow now, or you can wait 5 minutes and have 3. And most kids just stuff their face with the marshmallow, right? Because they don't show the impulse control to wait for the bigger reward. And there's all kinds of work sort of suggesting that has long-term consequences in their lives, because people who demonstrate lower levels of self-control have poorer outcomes for mental health and achievement and so on. And what we find is that the boredom prone, people who are highly boredom prone, also tend to have lower levels of self-control. And so that's a really important individual difference. They tend to also, there's sort of different ways in which humans pursue goals. And one of the distinctions that social psychologists will make is between what's sort of colloquially known as a just do it mode, people who get on with things, people who just go from one goal to the next and they very rapidly transition. And then a sort of do the right thing mode, people who prefer to sort of assess their options and make sure that they make the choice that's the best choice and to make sure not to make errors and so on. But what we find is that the boredom-prone people tend to be those do the right thing people. They tend to worry more about the options for action. So they tend then to fail to launch into action because they haven't sort of, they're not comfortable with the choices that are in front of them. There are a number of others as well. We find that people who are high in neuroticism, so they tend to have a lot of worry about life, they tend to be higher in boredom proneness as well. And there's even things that like people who are higher in what's known as covert narcissism. So covert narcissism is a person who sort of believes the world has failed to see their talents, has failed to see how brilliant they are. And so they're sort of a bit bitter about it, but they're not the arrogant in-your-face narcissist. They're just sort of a bit bitter about the fact that the world hasn't recognized their skills and talents yet. Those people tend to also be high in boredom proneness. So those are the kinds of individual differences that we know about so far that are associated with being more likely to experience boredom.
The big questions that I had going into this, right? Like, okay, well, why do we get bored? And then how do we keep ourselves from getting bored?
That's the $64,000 question, and I get asked it a lot. And the bottom line is that we don't have any really good data about this. One of the trends over the past 2 decades, I think, is, for people to sort of tout mindfulness training and mindfulness meditation as a kind of solution to everything. I'm highly skeptical of that. And I'm certainly skeptical of it for boredom, because in order to engage in mindfulness meditation, you need to have your attention focus on the meditation. And so if you've got a boredom prone person who struggles to focus their attention and you say, I know what's going to fix it. Here, focus your attention. I think it's probably not going to work. So the kinds of things that I say at the moment, when I get asked this question, is that there's a sort of triumvirate of things that you can do when you're in the moment of being bored. I'm not sure how well this helps the chronic bored person. But when you're in that moment, the first thing to do is to take a deep breath. So as I mentioned before, one of the most common things people report when they're bored is that they report feeling agitated and restless. Well, it's pretty hard to figure out what you want to do next or what you think would be a meaningful thing to engage with when you're restless, when you're agitated, when you're pacing around, right? So just to calm down, take a deep breath and allow that restlessness to dissipate. That's the first step. The second two steps are really contemplative. And the first one would be to say, well, why am I bored right now? What is it about the circumstance I'm in? And what that allows you to do is to perhaps reframe it, to think about it differently. So, people who work on assembly lines are not always bored because they can sometimes reframe the task. There's evidence that people on, assembly lines will say that they try to beat their personal best on the line every hour. Well, they've just turned a monotonous and potentially boring task into a personal challenge. And now it's not boring. And so if you find yourself in a moment of boredom, perhaps you can do the same thing. You can reframe the circumstance to be more meaningful, to be more purposeful for you. And now you won't be bored as much. And the third thing is that the other contemplative aspect of this is to sort of spend some time considering what your goals are, right? So boredom is showing us that in this moment, what we're doing is to us not very meaningful. Well, what is meaningful to us, right? We don't spend a lot of time in our lives thinking about that, considering what are the goals that I have? Am I pursuing them well? And if not, can I pursue them better? And when I talk about goals like that, I want to be careful about sort of setting people up for unrealistic expectations. I'm not talking about grand goals. I'm not saying that, every time you get bored, you should start to ponder why you haven't yet cured cancer. I'm thinking about any type of goal that's personally relevant to you. And they could be big and small. It could be from anything from, wanting to sort of foster better relationships with your family and friends, or wanting to get something small achieved in a hobby. It doesn't really matter what the size or scope of the goal is. What matters is that it matters to you.